Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in the series of Facebook Live conversations with Americans for Prosperity. I am super excited about today's conversation and today's guest. He is a name and a face that is probably familiar to many of you, but what you may not be familiar with is his affiliation with us here at Americans for Prosperity. He is the one and only Erick Erickson. Many of you may remember him from his days at Red State. I'm sure many of you listen to him every day on the radio. Today, Erick is also a member of the AFP Advisory Council, which we will get into. Erick, thanks so much for doing this with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we've got a big week ahead. You've got a big week ahead. We appreciate you taking a few minutes to chat with us as you are in the final stages of planning for what you are calling the gathering. Tell us about what the gathering is, what the purpose is, and who's going to be there.
Well, first of all, thank you guys for helping us and being a sponsor of it. The gathering is something I started when I was at Red State, where it was to try to get an online community to get in a room together, and instead of just being online people, break bread together, get to know each other, and hear from conservative thought leaders. And I've carried it over through the years, and now doing a national radio show, bringing both an online audience and a radio audience together in a room to hear from folks. And this year, we're going to bring in several of the presidential candidates to talk to. Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Chris Christie, along with Congressman Chip Roy, Congressman Rich McCormick, Governor Glenn Youngkin, Governor Brian Kemp, Senators Joni Ernst and Tom Cotton, among others, and really to ask them what their vision of the future is and how can we advocate in this day for limited government. And for the presidential candidates, instead of talking about, the elephant not in the room, so to speak, President Trump, I really want to talk to them about, if you were president, what would you do? And in particular, given the dynamics of the country right now, Donald Rumsfeld used to talk about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. I'm actually curious. I want to ask each of them, where do you think on the planet or in the country they should go explore to find out what are the unknown unknowns we don't even know about that we need to start thinking about as we design a policy to get us further into the 21st century?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on this a little bit, but there's a lot of uncertainty right now with the economy, the state of the country, how divided it seems like the two sides are. You're doing something interesting with the gathering, which is that it's not stump speeches, right? These guys, the presidential candidates, and even the other speakers, they get up all the time and no questions asked. They give a 10, 15-minute stump speech, say whatever they want, and they're never really challenged, which obviously is part of what being an elected official is about. You're doing something a little bit different and trying to be a little bit more incisive. Tell us about the format of the gathering and what people can expect that's a little different than some of the other events that they might be tuning into.
Yeah, so when I started this, everyone would give a 15, 20-minute speech, and then I would come up and we would field questions from the crowd. And instead, this time, what I want to do is get them on stage and actually have a conversation with them. No stump speeches. And I will allow questions to be pre-submitted from members of the audience that I will weave into the conversation, just so I can have questions from the crowd that the crowd wants answered, but also not allow them to just get in their comfort zone of giving a one-sided speech. I want them to engage and to actually answer people's questions the whole time, and also not filibuster, which a lot of them like to do. So I want to be a little more comfortable interrupting them if they go on too long.
Absolutely. Now, as far as issues, obviously you talk about a variety of things on your radio program every day. It seems like the news cycles move faster than anyone can keep up with. But one of the things AFP has been doing is we've been on the doors earlier than any other organization in the country, frankly, more than any other organization in the country, in early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. And we are hearing day after day after day that by far and away, the most important issue for Republican primary voters continues to be the economy, inflation, the job market. But that's not really necessarily what's dominating the conversation politically, either in the presidential primary or what we hear on Capitol Hill. Could you dissect a little bit what is that kind of disconnect, and how do we kind of get past that? What are you hoping to accomplish at the gathering to kind of bridge that gap between voter priorities, Republican, conservative, activist priorities, and what folks have been talking about, how we change that going forward?
Oh yeah, that's such a good question. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've told you this, Akash, but we've got a guy who listens to my radio program who's a door knocker with AFP, and he calls between knocking on doors and will sometimes call in and say, "I just had this conversation with someone," and he too, that it's all the economy, and he and I have had this conversation, and I have with a lot of other people that the candidates are talking about a culture war. Voters care about an economic fight, and really they're the same issue. And I think the key for Republican candidates winning in 2024 is to tie these together. That you're seeing the economic effects of a cultural realignment on the left, so to speak, with their aggressiveness on climate change, which is an economic issue, but also a cultural issue, or the issues that are happening in schools where kids are forced into a monopolistic public school system, and parents are having to pay to get their kids out of the system with their own money. They can't get their taxpayer money back, but to give their kids a better education, they've got to pay out of pocket. That's costing them. The cost of living is going up because of economic policies of this administration that are in place to shift culture in the country towards the left. And tying these issues together, that the cultural and the economic fight are really the same fight, if you talk about it a certain way, connects, I think, to a broader audience than a lot of the way the culture issues or the economic issues are being talked about right now.
Yeah, that's great. And you did a segment about Bidenomics last week. Just by the way, you have many of our staff, including myself, that listen to your show. We don't necessarily all call in every day like some folks might, but you did a segment on Bidenomics. I think it might have been last week, where you kind of got into this, and the way that I've summarized Bidenomics when I've gone out and done events with our grassroots and things like that is it is essentially taking the levers of government, taking your tax dollars, and rewarding his special interest allies, right? The environmentalist movement, labor unions, trial lawyers, ESG, DEI activists, whatever the case may be. Every public policy in President Biden's agenda seems geared towards benefiting one of those groups instead of an agenda of broad based prosperity. Now, I think it seems to me that people understand that Bidenomics is broken, and we're going around the country, which we'll talk about, sort of informing people about how it is broken. Um, but what they don't quite understand yet is what a positive, forward looking, conservative economic agenda to create broad based prosperity looks like. If you could sum up kind of what the key themes of something like that could be that do connect with people based on your experience talking to folks on your radio show, what does that agenda look like that is simple and connects and solves the problems people are concerned about?
So, I use everyone I think is familiar with the story of David and Goliath, and I try to compare it to the way our economy is structured right now. Is there's no chance for David to slay Goliath, let alone ever become a Goliath himself, because Goliath is surrounded by congressmen and lobbyists who protect him, who subsidize him, who give him preferential treatment of the tax code and on regulations, and they provide caps for small business owners. So, for example, once you hit a certain amount of growth, then the burdens go up so much more. You can never become big. State governments give massive subsidies to Fortune 500 companies to come into their states at the expense of the businesses that pre-exist in the state. The government realigns itself in such a way to subsidize and keep in place a number of businesses that should probably go out of business. The bankruptcy code is structured to preserve the biggest of the big at the expense of everyone else, breaking down those regulatory burdens. Democrats like to talk about, well, the regulations are good because they keep the economy stable. The problem is we've essentially manufactured a situation in this country where we've created so much unstable big, the government more and more has to prop these Goliaths up because they're going to fall over on their own weight. In doing so, yes, there might be some pain for folks, but also the creative destruction of the free marketplace allows entrepreneurs, the little guy, to see a way forward to become a big business. And we have, as a nation, regulation wise, and it's been on a bipartisan basis, we've denied the creative destruction of the free market, and we've now got so much unstable bigness in the country. The idea, for example, that we're going to just land this economic plane and raise interest rates and everyone's going to work out okay, I don't know that that works well for small businesses, mom and pop shops, for individual Americans who keep seeing their cost rising. and no innovation allowed into the marketplace because the cost of doing business and the regulatory structure has gotten so big and so high. If you're a Main Street business now in middle America, the amount of regulations you have to comply with just to open your door to do business in your community, not in the next community over, not in the next state over, just in your community, because of the federal government, has become too expensive for too many people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what we're doing, barnstorming the country. Last year, if you remember, AFP did a campaign where we were going to gas stations and grocery stores, primarily gas stations around the country, actually paying down the price of gas for people to what it was the day President Biden took office, which was $2.38, which as we got into midsummer got pretty expensive for us as gas was crossing $5 a gallon. Um, but we were doing a couple things. One, obviously helping lots of people who were waiting 2 hours in line to save 50, $60 on a tank of gas. And then it gave us a chance to talk to them about how public policy is making their life more difficult, right? Bad energy policy, reckless spending that was driving inflation, bad labor policies that were keeping workers on the sidelines. So we did a lot of that last year. This year, we're doing something a little bit different. We've launched what we're calling the Prosperity is Possible Tour. It's a nationwide bus tour. The bus will be parked out front at the gathering, which we're super excited to have on display and tell people about the policy solutions that we're working on, because I think that's one of the sort of discouragements that's crept into people's minds is they don't know if prosperity is in fact possible, if the American dream is possible for their children. We're pushing a pretty simple policy reform agenda, right? Let's one, end the reckless spending, two, free up our energy industry, and then three, empower American workers instead of special interests. I mean, those are three pretty common sense economic policies. But I think what one of the things that is concerning to people, and again, this is something you've talked about, and maybe you'll get into conversations with folks on stage at the gathering, is it isn't necessarily a partisan issue, and this it's actually kind of getting worse on the right as well, where you have some self-described conservatives who are now wanting to use the levers of government as a tool or as a weapon instead of just trusting the free market, trusting the innovation, the ingenuity of the American people. They're wanting to use government as a cudgel or as a tool. Talk about what that is, and then let's kind of get into what the machinations of that are and how we address that.
Yeah, look, there's a populist element on the right, I think, that wants to scratch the itch of retribution. The left has done these things with the tools of government. We should take back government, and we should do the same thing to the left. We should reward our friends and punish our enemies with the government. The problem is, historically in this country, you eventually lose power unless you're going to set up a dictatorship, which there are elements on the left and right both that flirt with that idea, which in our structure of government isn't going to happen on its own without a lot of force none of us want. So eventually you're going to lose power. The left will take back power. And if we continue to engage in the tit for tat, where when the left is in power, they reward their friends and punish their enemies, and then it flips and now we do it, we just further the economic destabilization in the country. And we do leave people behind who they're not your friends, but they're not your enemies. They're just on the sidelines trying to carry on about their business and get their kids to school and go to work. So the better solution on our side should be to gut the government, get rid of the power of the state to reward friends and punish enemies, get rid of the ability of the bureaucracy to regulate in ways that advance the left's agenda, because the right is fine without any new regulations. If we deregulate, roll it back, and then say, you can't do this anymore, suddenly the left is defanged, and the right should be okay with that. And we at the state level should be able to enact policies while also prohibiting states like California from enacting policies they know and are willfully designed to impact every other state. We can do that and disarm the left, whether they want it or not, because you get these things through Congress, they're going to have to fight to put them back in Congress before they can even deploy those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about. You mentioned Congressman Chip Roy is speaking at the gathering. He and I are actually doing an on-stage conversation. And what I'm hoping to do with him is dive into this a little bit, specifically in the area of regulation, the administrative state. Um, what is typically a pretty dry conversation, right? Federal agencies and the like, but has recently become, kind of a hot topic, right? President Trump obviously made a big issue of this. Every candidate on the campaign trail is talking about it, referring to it as the deep state, the bureaucracy, the administrative state, kind of the blob of alphabet soup agencies in Washington. Congressman Roy has been on the warpath against those agencies, trying to do exactly what you're talking about, shrink them to get them out of the way of the American people, instead of saying, hey, Republicans, we should be using them as a tool, as a weapon. How much of the problem that you are talking about, both with the burden on the American people and using government as a weapon, how much of that is happening in the administrative state through regulation specifically?
90% of it happens in the administrative state, not in Congress. In fact, Congress sets up these agencies to do their dirty work for them so they can rail against the administrative state and never do anything. Congressman Roy, to his credit, not just rails against them, but actually fights and tries to roll back. So many members of Congress, left and right, they argue against the administrative state, but they don't want to actually do anything. It's good to have guys like Chip, who's a dear friend of mine, who actually does want to roll it back. I mean, the gas stove ban, the water heater ban, the cafe standards for cars that price people out of gas powered cars. All of those come from the regulatory state. So much of the business burdens of the country come from the regulatory state. I mean, for Pete's sake, the Supreme Court just had a case where the EPA tried to regulate drainage off someone's property because down the street from them was a lake, even though the water wasn't running to the lake. The EPA said, well, it could go underground and get into the lake, therefore we get to regulate it. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't. Too many of these regulatory agencies are where the left has taken power. What I don't think people realize is the way the federal government works is when a presidential administration is leaving power, a lot of the political appointees can move into the civil service for comparable pay and comparable jobs within the civil service. And you see a lot more Democrats do that than Republicans at the end of administration. So Barack Obama's office leaves, and a lot of his political appointees become career civil servants who stay during the Trump administration and can slow down the processes of government, figure out where they want to go when a Democrat comes back, and then rev it back up when Democrats come in. This is civil service reform is one of the big issues that we have to tackle, but also just taking the power away from the regulatory state to even regulate.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that's one of the key points is that by and large, regulators are going to want to regulate, which benefits the agenda of progressives, not conservatives. And so for conservatives to put a lot of faith in the administrative state as a tool to advance conservatism, I think is kind of inherently flawed thinking. And that's part of what what we'll get into. And it's one of the challenges that we face going around the country, doing events, knocking doors, etc. at AFP is informing people about these kind of basic truths. One, because they're not going to get a fair shake in the mainstream media, as you've talked about. And two, this level of detail simply doesn't exist in the vast majority of the discourse. Shifting gears a little bit, I mean, you get on the radio every day and inform the American people about important issues. We're doing it at doors and on phone calls every day with our activists and our staff. I mean, what do you make of the information landscape in this country? And specifically for conservatives, what can they do to be better prepared and be better advocates to grow our movement going forward, given what the landscape looks like?
Oh, honestly, this is a great way for me to plug Americans for Prosperity and what you guys do. There are a lot of conservative organizations in America that really are just tools of the Republican Party, which there's nothing wrong with that. But the Republican Party is designed to get candidates elected, not to actually fight for ideas. And Americans for Prosperity is one of the few groups out there that I think actually fights for ideas and is also willing to work across the aisle where there might be some common ground, as opposed to just our job is to help the Republicans. It's actually to advance limited government, free markets, and free people, to advance the ideas for prosperity in the country. And I think conservatives plugging into a group that's not beholden to a political party, that is tied to the ideas those people believe in, is a smart thing to do. I am a little bit frustrated these days that so much of the conversation and a lot of conservative talk is just the talking points of the party and the day-to-days of the political campaigns and nonstop attacks of Joe Biden without any accountability for our own side. I'm a firm believer that we've got to hold our own side accountable, because I mean, the other side just wants to defeat us. And if we don't hold our side accountable and keep it cleaned up, eventually we make it easy for the other side to defeat us. So we've got to be able to hold our own side accountable and also come up with the ideas for our side. So it's not just about acquiring power. It's about actually, once you get the power, how do you then get rid of it so the other side can't use it once they come back into office?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple minutes left here. I mentioned at the top that you are a member of the AFP Advisory Council. Essentially, what that advisory council is, it's a small collection of high profile, sort of external facing surrogates like yourselves People can learn more on our website, AFP Advisory Council. Yourself, Guy Benson, former Congressman Jeb Hensarling, a number of folks like that in the media sphere, political sphere, who help inform our strategy. They advocate for our ideas externally. Why did you choose to work with us, and what do you see as kind of a mutual benefit for you and for our organization of our partnership?
The reason I enjoy it is because I was an elected Republican. For a number of years, I was on a city council as a Republican. And to this day, I can't really tell you what the Republican Party stands for anymore. One of the things that I found when I was on city council is that there is no Republican or Democrat position on trash collection. There's a conservative philosophy of maybe we can privatize it and it can become more efficient, and a progressive philosophy of maybe we should just hire more people as wards of the state and let them collect the trash. There's not really a party position. And have become more and more mindful over time, having been elected at a local office. There aren't a lot of think tanks that are actually what I would call a do tank, that they stay in Washington and they write white papers and they scratch their beards and they go to Congress, but they're not actually out on the ground in the states doing the work of the conservative movement, knocking on doors, persuading people, teaching activists how to go to a city council and make a case, and how to work with a city councilman or a state legislator to advance the fight for freedom. And that's what AFP does. And I'm glad to be a part of it on the advisory council to try to steer that energy towards not just being a white paper organization in Washington, but actually activists in the states fighting for freedom.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up here, tell us about the gathering one more time. What can people expect? And if they want to either attend in person or tune in online, how can they do so?
If they go to ewerickson.com, they'll see a link. There might be a ticket left. I actually think we're like right at fire marshal capacity for the room at this point. We had more people come than we expected, plus a lot of media. But the online portal available on some cable networks is going to stream the whole thing for us. Fox and CNN, ABC, CBS, NBC will be there. But we're going to have these candidates and groups of people. We've got 47 states in the room of people coming. Be about 1,000 different people from 47 states here to hear the candidates running for president, and also thought leaders of the conservative movement talk about this fight we have ahead to kind of free up the nation and defang Washington.
Absolutely. Again, that is ewerickson.com. Folks can learn more about the gathering. If folks want to learn more about the campaign that AFP is launching, it is called Prosperity is Possible. You can visit prosperityispossible.com. We will be at the gathering. Super excited to sponsor that event. Again, you can learn more at EW Erickson. That's EWERICKSON, ewerickson.com to learn about the gathering, prosperityispossible.com to learn about the AFP tour, get involved with us, become an activist, as Eric said, help advance the conservative movement, because it's more important now than ever, given the challenges we face. So, Eric, thank you so much for your time today. I know you've got a ton going on with the gathering coming up. We appreciate your partnership, and we're very much looking forward to this weekend and working with you going forward.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Great. I think that is
all right. I just see your note. Can you spell Erickson for us? Yes, good.